Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for joining in. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter Llewellyn. I run the service at MedComms where you'll find resources and services and activities aimed at the global MedComms community, by which I mean medical education, communication, and publishing people around the globe. One of the things I'm doing at the moment is I'm running these Zoom meetings in an effort to get more people from more places engaging with each other, sharing information and ideas. And the idea, all being well, is that we'll run this Zoom meeting today. We'll capture the recording and we'll post the recording on NetworkPharma TV. If you haven't seen it yet, if you pop over to NetworkPharma TV, you'll find now a couple of hundred videos on all sorts of aspects of MedComms, including a number of these Zoom webinars. So we're building up hopefully a useful resource there that anyone can access anytime. So that's NetworkPharma TV. But basically, medcommsnetworking.com tells you about everything that is happening. So today, delighted to have Hannah Bridges with me. Hannah's a specialist in patient materials, writing for patients. I've simply asked her to come online today, do a presentation about writing for patients, involving patients in communications materials. We'll have a talk for about 15, 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A. So Hannah, if you're ready, I'm going to hand over to you. There you go.
Great, thank you, Peter. So let me share my screen, then I will get started. Okay, so thank you very much for having me today, Peter, and thanks everybody for joining. For those of you who don't know me, I've worked as an editor and a writer in a number of different sectors, so medical communications, charity sector, and the public sector. And I'm currently working as a freelancer, writing for patients and also for professionals. I'm also involved in best practice promotion, and I've been a judge for the BMA Patient Information Awards. In today's webinar, I'm bringing together the two sides of my business to provide tips for MedComms writers on how to write for patients, carers, and the public. So what will you hear about today? I'm going to talk about getting into the right mindset for writing for patients, knowing your audience, writing tips and tricks, and where to find out more. What I won't be covering is design, appraising the evidence. I should think that you're all familiar with doing an evidence search, regulatory considerations, and endorsements of services. So let's look at some general principles to begin with. Patients have a right to accurate and unbiased information, and they have a right to improve their health, to be their own expert, and to choose what to do. Your role is to be an enabler. So your content needs to be easy to follow, to reflect the balance of evidence clearly. It should acknowledge unique experience and preferences of patients, and it should support informed choice. So there's so much theory to cover today. I decided to boil it down into 3 guiding lights to talk you through. And those are being understandable, being engaging, and being impactful. So let's start off with how you can be understandable. When I first started working in the public sector and writing for patients, I worked for the Healthcare Commission, and I cringe when I remember that I asked why we have to dumb it down so much, and I queried whether we were making things patronising. And this is a sentiment that I still hear people echoing now, or you might say patients with condition X tend to have a good grasp of the science. So I'm hoping that with some health literacy theory, I can challenge that mindset. So what is health literacy? It's people having the skills, so that could be the language, the literacy, and the numeracy, having the knowledge, the understanding, and the confidence to be able to access, understand, evaluate, and navigate health and social care information and services. And through your work writing for patients and carers and the public, you are able to influence health literacy levels. So remember that you're providing a service that could be as key to patients as their treatments. So don't be fooled by the patients that you might come across in advocacy groups or online. They tend to be highly motivated, enabled people, and they're not necessarily representative of your entire patient population. So in England, 42% of working age adults are unable to understand or make use of everyday health information. And that rises to 61% when numeracy skills are also required for comprehension. Having low health literacy matters. It's linked to limited education, job quality, and social networks. It's also linked to a less healthy lifestyle, and people who have lower health literacy are less able to take control of their health. It's also linked to a higher risk of morbidity, premature death, and long-term health conditions. So if you remember just one thing from my presentation, what I'd like it to be is that when you pitch your information at too high a literacy level, numeracy level, you are exacerbating health inequalities and you're failing to help the people most likely to have the poorest outcomes. So with that said, I hope that motivates you to want to write in plain English, otherwise known as accessible writing. And here are a few tips. Assume no prior knowledge. Aim for a reading age of 11 to 14, or actually, if you can, aim for 9 to 11, tricky to do. Try to get rid of any technical terms and jargon in your writing. There will be terms that you'll want to explain because they're terms that the patient's going to come across during their care, but make sure you explain them using easy words rather than producing a glossary term. Keep your sentences under 20 words. I promise it is possible. You just need to look at how to break them up properly. And keep your facts really clear and concise. Lastly, it's always useful to have a summary. Sometimes it might actually be nice to put that at the beginning of the content rather than at the end. It helps people to find the key messages. So I'm just going to show through an example here of a sentence and how I might go about trying to simplify it. And I tend to look at the sentence and think, what should I omit? What can I explain? And what can I simplify? So here's the example. In a phase 1 or 2 study of the TRK inhibitor larotrectinib, 55% of patients were progression-free at 1 year. What I'd do here is I'd probably omit phase 1 or 2 or simplify it if I really felt there was strong justification for patients needing to understand the phases of trials. I would explain a TRK inhibitor, and I would look to simplify these facts on 55% and progression-free survival. So what might that look like? It could change into something like this. Larotrectinib is a new treatment for certain rare cancers. It kills cancer cells that make a protein called TRK. In a small study, people with a TRK cancer were treated with larotrectinib for 1 year. The cancer did not grow in about 11 out of every 20 patients. And if you wanted to, you might want to add a nice little graphic there which shows those numbers. In general, people understand absolute numbers better than they understand percentages. So that's the reason that I've made that change there. And I've gone for the lowest possible denominator of 20 without having half patients. Sometimes you see these images with half a person coloured in, and I think that's quite confusing. The way that you decide to reword the content will depend on the scope and the purpose of your information product, the intended audience, and also the hard facts. You'll need to use your judgment as to how you can simplify things and still keep them accurate. It can be a tricky challenge when deciding how complicated to be. So on one hand, you could have very complicated information and you might perceive that to be more accurate, or you could have simple information which is more understandable. You will find that you're probably erring too much on the right hand side of this example, and your clients will probably challenge you as well at times, being concerned obviously about accuracy. What I would encourage you to do is to try and move towards the left of this slide. My rule of thumb is to aim for the greatest number of patients possible coming away with an understanding that they could share with others. So just keep in mind, if you're making it more complicated, for example, you're putting p-values in there, people might walk away without that understanding at all. Another way that you can be more understandable is to give appropriate context. So here's our imaginary little patient. He's just read my text. And is thinking, is 11 out of 20 good? Are other treatments available? How well do they work? Which have the worst side effects? So in your writing, try and anticipate the questions that you might people might have and complete that broader picture for them. So you might, for example, want to give an introduction to relevant cancer types or an overview of treatment options with key risks and benefits. going to move on now to guiding light number 2, which is how to be engaging. I can't say this enough. You need to get to know your audience. So, for example, is this a long-term condition? A patient's likely to have had many prior treatments. Are their symptoms likely to be controlled? What challenges do they face? Are their anxiety levels likely to be high? What might motivate them to better their health? What age are they? And what information ultimately do they need? Is it already available? And in what format do they want it? And keep in mind that you might have some patients in your audience who need special formats such as large print, designed for dementia, or text to speech. So I imagine you're now thinking, how can I get to know my audience? So here I'm just going to cover some different ways that you could do audience research. The amount of resource that you put into this will depend in part on the goals of your project, the knowledge you already have, and also your budget. So a good starting point is to look at any information that your organisation or your client already holds on the intended audience. Just make sure that it's recent and that it's still applicable. For me, the holy grail of researching an audience is to hold a focus group. It's a great way of doing co-production, but it's also quite resource heavy. And I would caution that focus groups need very careful planning, focus tasks with a clear scope, and very careful review of the results. So I would consider getting expert help, or at least an expert moderator here, unless you're very familiar with running a focus group. Surveys can be a quick and easy way of getting insights. They're a simple way to find out what topics of interest would be you should include. And they're also a great way to get feedback on drafts, but they do have their limitations. So depending on where and how you conduct them, they can be quite biased. Always try and include a print version, because if you just rely on online, you're going to bias it, for example, to patients who tend to use the web. You can conduct a literature search to try and find insights. I generally find, to be honest, there's limited useful data out there that you can apply to your writing. But for long-term conditions such as diabetes, there is information out there on patient preferences. So do have a quick look. It might help. Soft data on patient experience you'll find by exploring forums and social media listening. That can be really useful for helping you to start seeing through a patient's eyes, but be aware that there will be inherent bias, for example, if you're looking at a forum. And lastly, when it comes to testing material that you've drafted, a user testing lab can be really useful. They can do all sorts of funky things like check people's eye movement across the screen to see which content they're reading and which they're skipping over because maybe it's too complicated or not appealing. And also it's a good way of getting patients to feedback to you what they have understood from your information, so you can really get a good grasp of whether or not it's understandable. Another way that you can make sure that your copy is engaging is to be relevant. So use the insights you've gained and apply that to your copy and the scope of it. So going back to our example, you can expect that people might want to know, is their cancer TRK positive? Is this a treatment that's available for them? Would they be suitable for it? You can see here that now we've considered how to be relevant and add context, the copy here is really beginning to bloom. So I'd encourage you to think also about how you can signpost out to others. So it might be that with questions on whether the drug's available and if it's suitable for the patient, you want to signpost them to their healthcare professional, for example. So the third guiding line is how to be impactful. And I would say if you want to be impactful, you need to be thinking about driving change. So if you've written your health information, even if you're just aiming to raise awareness, could you include some actions that are going to make it have more impact? So sharing that information with others. Some potential actions here, just to get you in the right mindset: raising awareness, attending screening or appointments, making informed decisions, signing up for a trial or a service, or having better self-care or healthy living. Turning ideas into action. So how can you come up with those actions? My tips here are to only set evidence-based goals. So don't encourage patients to take a certain action. unless it's actually proven to improve health. Secondly, be smart in the way that you plan your goals and how you're going to measure them. So I judge for the BMA awards, and one of the places where people seem to fall down is they have great ideas of say healthy lifestyle choices that they want patients to take and how they're going to get there, but they haven't thought about how they're going to measure it. So it's really difficult to tell if that content actually has had a positive effect. So I would encourage you to use smart planning, which means that you need your goals to be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. Also think about applying behaviour change theory. So if you want people to change their behaviour, do some research. There's a few different models out there, and 3 principles that are generally quite universal is to think about giving your audience motivation. So what is the risk of them not doing anything, and what are the benefits of the action that you're proposing? Give clear calls to action and support self-efficacy. That means giving people the knowledge, the skills, the tools, and the support to improve their health. So rather than just giving people a lot of pros and cons and expecting them to weigh that up, coach people through how they can make an informed choice and how they can weigh up 2 different treatment options. Lastly, say don't do this alone. There are experts out there in impactful communications, goal setting, online behaviour patterns in your organisation or beyond. So make use of their knowledge. And coming back to an earlier point, don't forget that one key expert is the patient. Lastly, you can dial up your impact by using engaging design and copy. I'm focusing more on the copy here. So lean towards punchy sentences and short paragraphs, but also mix it up because a change in rhythm keeps it more interesting to read. Consider using a press release style approach. So that's where your important facts come first, your headline, your important facts, and then there's more nitty and gritty later. But be aware that sometimes you need a logical flow for people to understand the process. You might want to use surprise to get your readers' attention, but I would say tread really carefully there. If you shock and scare people, they tend to disengage, so it might have the opposite effect that you're intending it to have. Remember, these are people living with this condition day in, day out, so they don't necessarily need a reminder of the scary stuff. Anecdotes are often inappropriate in health information because they give a very skewed picture. But that said, patient stories and quotes can be a really fantastic way to engage your audience, and they give insights and tips. They can also help to break up the copy with pictures and with videos. I would recommend using visuals because that can increase your engagement and it can also increase understanding. A simple chart can tell a story far better than words. If you're using diagrams though, please test them with your target audience. There's an awful lot of infographics out there. They all look very pretty. Some are very good and others, to be frank, don't work. And lastly, I would say use appropriate and respectful language to boost engagement, but also to reduce stigma, fear, and misinterpretation. And you'll want to avoid dehumanizing terms. Just a practical example or two here. Rather than saying females, you might want to say women. HIV sufferers, it would be more appropriate to say people living with HIV. An arthritic patient would be better worded as a person with arthritis. Elderly, say older people. Palliative care is an interesting one. I've included it here. I'm not saying you should never use the term. There are instances where it's going to be appropriate, but be aware when you say palliative care, people here care for people who are about to die. So sometimes saying treatment of symptoms might be a nicer, fairer way of putting it depending on the circumstance. And patient adherence sounds a little bit judgy and preachy, so consider something like taking your medicines at the right time. Lastly, the word patient, yes, it is the title of my presentation, but be careful about when you use it. If somebody, for example, has a long-term condition and they have good symptom control, they won't see themselves as a patient, they're just a person. So be careful about when you use patients or subjects. So I think probably that's about all I have time for. So my 3 guiding lights were to be understandable by using plain English and giving context, to be engaging by knowing your audience and being relevant, and to be impactful by driving change and using engaging design and copy. I hope this has been a useful presentation and that focusing on user experience has helped you to consider how you can raise the bar for your health information. Here are some resources. You're welcome to do a screen grab or come back and have a look at the presentation. I know that Peter's going to put it online. There's loads of really helpful resources out there. These are my favourites. The Patient Information Forum has a toolkit on how to produce good information. They've got tips on writing for children, also a guide on appraising health information. The NHS has just developed a new guide on writing digital health information. It's for NHS staff, but you would find it useful too. The Plain English campaign has been around for a long time. They do great work, and they also are able to come out and host training sessions. Discern has a list of a checklist for treatment information that you might want to take a look at. And on the government website, there's information on accessible design. So how do you design, for example, for people with dementia, so that they're more easily able to use your information. And if you want more information on health literacy, there's some great stuff on this site. Lastly, I've put the BMA Patient Information Awards there. You can have a look at this year's winners, previous year's winners. There's some great examples there of different types of health information. And I'd also encourage you to enter the Patient Information Awards. I believe it's about February that the closing date comes round. It's not open yet, but that's a great way of getting kudos for all your hard work. It's a great way to demonstrate that you're putting patients first. And we did, I think, for the first time, have a runner-up that was a pharma company this year. So definitely entries from the pharma and MedComms industry are very much welcomed. Thank you very much. So at this point, I will stop sharing my screen, right, Peter, and we'll go through to questions.
That's absolutely perfect. Thank you, Hannah. Yeah. Okay, and can I say that I thought that was an excellent presentation. Well done. And indeed, Katie's just said in the chat box, just wanted to mention these ways to speak about patients are very empowering. Thank you. It's a timely reminder to think about our audiences, and I think that's absolutely right. I'm sure we'd all say that. It is very trendy at the moment to talk about patients and concerning about patients. I would perhaps argue that lots of us have been doing it for a long time, but it is there's a lot going on at the moment, and I think a lot of the points you made there were very, very important. Personally, if I can put my own personal viewpoint on this one, I think your point, which was very clearly made, I would absolutely back up. You've got to be very careful. It's very trendy to have patient conferences with patient experts and so on, and they can be a misleading group. As important as they might be, you can be misled by the expertness of some of the people who are talking on behalf of patients. So, frankly, thank you very much. I thought that was excellent. I'm going to so 2 things. Firstly, I'm going to say to the audience here, just a reminder: if you've come in during the presentation, you've got a chat button and a Q&A button at the bottom of your window. Please use either of those facilities to send in some comments or questions or whatever, and we'll then pick them up from here. I'm very much going to be led by you for the next 10-15 minutes or so. Can I just say, I think I saw that question a question come in very early on. I think I'd just like to touch on it a little bit, if I may, because working in the way that I do and encouraging people to come into MedComms and so on, writers and so on, there is quite a frequent question about, I want to write for patients. And MedComms generally, the focus is healthcare professionals rather than patients, and maybe there's a bit of a switch, but it's still generally healthcare professionals. I just wondered, just for everyone's information, and there will be a mixture of people on the audience, just give us a flavour of how you've got to where you've got, because I think that might be interesting for some of the people on the audience.
I got to where I am by choosing to make a move from MedComms into public sector and charity sector. That was a decision for me because I wanted to write for a different audience, and I wanted kind of a change of scene. So that's how I went about it. It's not the only way that you could do it. Having gained all that knowledge, I'm now applying it to MedComms as well. And MedComms has changed in that time. Writing for patients is now something that you can do within the MedComms arena, whereas it used to be much harder to get into.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so let's deal with some of the questions that are starting to come in quite quickly. And let's, I'm gonna actually ask a question which hasn't been asked yet, but I wanted to get this one in quick, and then I'll go on to another question which actually has been picked up by the audience. So my first question, just to touch on the sort of whole question of kite marks, quality marks, and so on. And I asked you about this recently, Hannah. I know that the Patient Information Forum have just announced that they're working on a new initiative. I think I'm right in saying in the presentation you didn't touch on sort of kite marks and those sorts of quality marks. Can you just say a few words about that sort of landscape, and specifically maybe because I know you're involved with PIF, what they're doing there? Can you just say a few words on kite marks there?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the UK, there was until recently an information standard scheme, and that was something that NHS England set up. It was anybody was able to be a member. It was very audit based, but it was a way of making sure that your organisation had the right process in place. So it wasn't looking at the end product and judging the quality of the health information. It was saying, how are you researching it? Are you involving patients? Are you involving experts? It was a really, really good scheme, but unfortunately the NHS has decided that it's not something that they can afford to fund anymore. I believe that's the reason that it's finished. So PIF, the Patient Information Forum, has recently stepped up to the mark and said that they will set up a new scheme. It's early days. They're working with a number of different organisations, most charities, not all, to pilot a new scheme. So we just need to watch that space, really. I'm hoping that they'll take all the best stuff from the information standard, but hopefully make it a little bit easier and simpler for organisations to run. I would say keep an eye on it. It's probably going to be a very, very good way of making sure that you have a good system in place for developing patient information.
Okay, and just as a simple question, but I guess you've already implied it. I mean, kite marks of that nature are a good thing, are they?
I think they are a very good thing. The downside for the information standard, I think, was that they didn't promote it to patients. So although it was very useful for people like myself, people in the industry, for judging how well written something was, I'm not sure that patients would have ever known what that kite mark meant. So hopefully we'll see PIF do some more promotion. There's the Plain English campaign. That's not just for health information, that's for any information for the public. And I think people are more aware of that kite scheme. It is a good scheme as well. So that's another one to consider.
Okay, again, I'm not sure if this is a slightly unfair question, but I'm aware that we've got at least a few people coming in from outside the UK, and we're talking about UK and plain English and all the rest of it. Can one make a very simple comment and say, presumably in other parts of the world, there are similar sort of plain German, plain whatever type initiatives, or are you aware or not of those sorts of activities?
I'm afraid I'm not aware of ones in other languages. I've got a very good grasp of English, but not of any other languages. So it's not something I'm aware of. In the US, I know that there is a big push for it, so I would expect there to be more schemes. But yeah, sorry, I can only advise on the ones over here in the UK.
Okay, so just to the audience, and as I say, I know at least some of you are from outside of this country, so if you've got any anything you can share on that front that we can point people at, then do use those tools. So I was going to definitely ask this, and it's quite interesting that several questions came straight in on this question about readability, tools, tests, and so on. We've had, I mean, for instance, for what it's worth, just putting a bit of a plug on NetworkPharma TV, you'll find John Dixon doing a whole presentation on readability tools. So let's not get too far into it. But as a principle, are you for readability tools or not? I know there can be some discussion and the different sorts. So without getting too bogged down in it, but can you just give us a few of your comments on the sort of readability tools that are talked about?
Yeah, I've seen a few questions come in on this, and I think that readability tools are useful, especially if you're starting out writing for patients and the public, and you want some feedback about how readable your information is. I generally don't use them. I use my own judgment, and I like to test things with patients to find out how understandable it is. And I think going back to the patient is far better. They do have their place. I wouldn't recommend any in particular because, as I say, I personally like to use my own judgment. But I would recommend people go to John Dixon's talk. Sounds like it would be a useful one.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. We've got a question there from Anonymous. Any top tips for writing lay abstracts for submission to congresses?
Yes, I would say the example that I gave, where you're taking content and then you're simplifying it, that is a good place to start. Um, Ask yourself what backstory you need to give. So generally, a paper will just go zoom straight in, talking about the methods, the results, and there won't be sufficient background for patients about the condition or why the study was being conducted. And answering those questions for patients is key. So be aware that what they're interested in might not be the same as a professional. So like with the example I gave, you could talk about results of a paper which say how efficacious, how safe a treatment is. The patient's actually probably more interested to know whether they can get hold of that treatment, whether it's available on a prescription. So you honestly need to put yourself in the mindset of a patient and think, what are they likely to ask?
Okay. And I suppose the similar sorts of comments, I mean, there's quite a lot of talk at the moment about writing abstracts for articles of one sort or another. I mean, there's some debate, I suppose, over the terminology of sort of patient lay summaries, or the sort of the summaries that go with the articles in published papers, just for a moment. So the same points apply there, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the same points do apply. When I've written a lay summary, I've tended to find that it can be achievable in the word count. Unfortunately, often you've got a more limited word count than the abstract, so you might only be looking at 250 words. So, but I would say at least a third, if not half of that, is going to be context rather than key facts from the paper or from the study. So be prepared that you need to make quite a lot of changes to the content.
Okay, and again, just to cover it off, I should have checked with you beforehand, maybe, but I think I know the answer to the question. But just to clarify, in terms of clinical trial summaries, adding lay summaries to the clinical trials on the databases, my understanding is the European, is the EMA, have yet to mandate it. Is that the current position? We're still waiting for that to
Yes,
be mandated.
it should be mandated. In theory, it's something that should be happening, but it's not being followed up. When I last checked a few weeks ago, the problem was Brexit. Because they've had to move their offices, they've had to cut back on any activity that's non-essential. And unfortunately, the lay summary work is non-essential. So there's not as much happening as we'd hoped for there. And looking at the position in the States, there was a group of doctors that lobbied the FDA saying that we should have lay summaries there as well. There is a push for it, but so far nothing's been mandated over in the States.
Okay, thanks, Claire. Well, let's all hope that in the next few weeks things will start to sort themselves out on all sorts of fronts. Okay, so we've got a question from Steve there. Let's talk a bit about this. I don't know how much direct knowledge you have of this, but can you tell us more about how you use eye tracking in a testing laboratory? You mentioned that in your presentation.
Yes, yeah. So the idea with eye tracking is that by looking at the way that someone's reading content, I wish I had an example slide I could pull up, but you can see how much of the copy they're actually reading and how much time they're dwelling on it. And if the copy is not understandable, what you'll see is people very quickly scrolling through the screen, trying to kind of find something that they can grasp onto. Whereas if it's understandable, people are going to be going through it much more logically. You tend to find if your copy is too complicated that people are drawn more to the pictures and bullet points than anything else. So it can be quite a useful tool from that sense.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Okay, I'm actually going to. I've got, as I always say at this point, an eye on the clock, and I'm quite keen that we try and stick to the timing we've set. So, can I suggest we sort of bring this part of the session to an end? So the recording, which we'll hopefully put on NetworkPharma TV. So I just want to say a big thank you, because I thought that was an excellent presentation. There's been some excellent questions in there. To those of you who are listening to us online, please don't all rush away if you don't need to, because we will happily carry on talking through to the top of the hour. But for now, and as I say, for the recording, can I say a huge thanks to Hannah? Can I say that if anyone's watching this and interested in what we're doing, come to medcommsnetworking.com. And at the moment, we're running weekly webinars on all sorts of topics, so do come and join in. But thank you, Hannah. I thought that was an excellent presentation. I'm sure you're perfectly happy for people to follow up and connect with you on LinkedIn or something like that, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I know that I've only glossed over a few things today. There was so much to cover, so please, yeah, do feel free to get in touch on LinkedIn. Send me a message.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording now. I like to give a little wave. Bye bye.
Bye.